Hi, everyone. This is Yusuf Can, the program coordinator from the Middle East program at the Wilson Center. I'm here today with Ambassador Jim Jeffrey, the chair of the Middle East program at the Wilson Center and former ambassador to Iraq, Turkey, and Albania. Today, we are going to be talking about the recent developments in Syria and the territorial gains made by the opposition forces in Northwest, especially surrounding Aleppo. Thank you, Ambassador, for taking the time this morning to talk about what's happening in Syria. And to get into the main question, could you potentially provide an analysis of what's going on in the region in Syria and how the U.S. allies, how Turkey, or how the Assad regime could potentially respond to what's happening on the ground?
Certainly, and glad to be doing this with you today, Yusuf. First of all, regionally, what we have had at the broadest level has been a 20-year expansion of Iranian influence from a low point around 2000 to a high point on the 6th of October through proxies and Iran's own efforts developing thousands of long-range missiles, its nuclear program. But again, I emphasize through its proxies in Arab states, Lebanon, Yemen, Iraq, Gaza, and to some degree Syria in alliance with the Assad regime. On October 7th, that all changed because for the first time, an Iranian proxy did something dramatically existential to a major non-Iranian power, that is Israel, and that has led to a cascade, a snowballing set of events that has drawn in various powers more or less allied with Israel and the U.S. against Iran and its proxies throughout the region. Lebanon, obviously Gaza, the Houthis in the Red Sea, some involvement of Iraqi militias, and of course the missile war between Iran and Israel. The results have been, as we've seen in that missile war and in the Hezbollah ceasefire, is a dramatic change in the region against Iran and its allies. In that context, this offensive by Syrian opposition forces, and particularly Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, which is a former al-Qaeda element, technically still on the terrorism list of the United States and other countries, and not officially part of the Syrian opposition, but fairly closely supported by Turkey, launched an offensive that has seized a great deal of terrain from Assad and his Russian and Iranian allies, including the second city of Syria, Aleppo. This is dramatic, but we have seen such advances before in the Middle East, the Taliban in Afghanistan, the Islamic State in 2014 in Mosul. So these kinds of shifts are often the case when there is an underlying political situation that encourages resistance to a regime, because that's the Syrian aspect to this. In the Trump administration, the Syrian conflict, a civil war, multi-layered with Israeli, Turkish, American, and other outside involvement, was frozen with Assad controlling part of the country, and a set of shaky ceasefires were established. That balance has now been broken, and everybody is rushing to try to find a new balance within Syria to stop the fighting and stabilize the situation, which nobody wants to see Syria descend into chaos. The result, however, will be a further diminution of Iranian power in the region. The Russians will have to save Assad to the extent he can be saved with their air power. Iran doesn't have air power that can be used in Syria. And I think that one outcome of this, building on the ceasefire in Lebanon, will be a commitment by the Assad regime to seal the border with Lebanon and block new Iranian weapons transfers to Hezbollah. That would be a very important development.
Okay, thank you so much, Ambassador. So you mentioned HTS and other opposition groups and Turkey's role in this. I wanted to get back to the Assad regime in a second, but before that, I want to ask you about Turkey's role in this, because both on international media and social media, Turkey's role has been discussed quite a bit. So do you think that what's the current level of involvement with the Turkish government with the rebel factions, including HTS, but not necessarily limited to the HTS? Plus, do you think how do you think these dynamics fit into Turkey's broader strategic objectives in northern Syria, especially with its efforts with limiting Kurdish influence in the region?
Well, Turkey has long been a major player in Syria. First, as one of the countries, along with the United States and Arab countries, that supported the opposition. With limited exceptions, the U.S. and other countries dropped off of that, but Syria continued its support for both the political and the armed Syrian internal opposition. And in fact, those forces who are very much in effect under Turkish control, have joined in on the offensive along with Hayat Tahrir al-Sham. Now, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham is not part of the official opposition, but it has close, if informal, ties with Turkey, and it is hard for me to imagine that Turkey didn't greenlight to one or another degree their offensive. And as I said, Turkey definitely greenlighted the joining of that offensive by these other opposition forces. Turkey's larger objectives in northern Syria are mainly defensive. Turkey doesn't want to seize any territory, but rather it wants to create, first of all, a buffer zone to avoid further refugees flowing into Turkey. They have about 3.5 million refugees. It has cost them many tens of billions of dollars to support them. It doesn't want more refugees in. If possible, this buffer zone could serve to relocate the Syrian refugees back out of Turkey into areas where they feel safe. And these refugees do not feel safe in areas where Assad's forces are. Finally, Turkey has a whole set of potential foes in Syria. They include, as you said, the PKK offshoot, the YPG, many of whom are working with the U.S. in northeast Syria. The Islamic State, which has launched a whole series of devastating terrorist attacks in Turkey. And of course, the Iranians, Assad, and Russia are not seen as particularly friendly to Turkey. So in order to maintain this balance and to push away from its borders all of these threats, from refugee flows to various terrorist attacks to hostile powers on its frontier, Turkey has supported seizing territory or allowing the opposition to seize territory. And this was a major new development. I think probably the Turks themselves were surprised at the extent of the success that the opposition has just had.
I'm sure they were surprised. It was quite rapid. Going back to the question about Assad and how it potentially would get help from Iran in the near or long-term future. So obviously the Assad regime faces challenges, military challenges, economic challenges, and shifting alliances, and has been facing increasing pressures from both domestic factions and international actors. So even if it does get help from Iran or Russia, whether it's military or economic, do you see a long-term resolution where Assad regime survives even after all of this and the continuing military offensive? Or maybe it potentially comes to a conclusion where Assad regime does survive, but leaves a lot of territory to opposition forces. What do you think is the future of the Assad regime?
Well, let's start with the past. In the Trump administration, we stabilized the situation by a loose coalition of Israeli, Turkish, and American military forces inside Syria. Now, they were all there for different purposes, but their net effect was to block Assad's reconquista of its territory, along with various local forces that we and the Turks supported. And that led to a freezing of the conflict and a set of shaky ceasefires that have been in effect since 2019, 2020, until just now. But this was never a stable solution. The U.S. and the UN and most countries pushed for Resolution 2254, passed at the end of 2015 with Russian and American support to reconcile the various Syrian factions and have an internationally led new government and essentially reforms. That was never possible because Assad, backed by Iran and Russia, refused to take that step. But on the other hand, they could not continue their offensive because, as I said, of the situation, the frozen conflict. The conflict has become unfrozen for three reasons. One, Russia and Iran, the main supporters of Assad, have been distracted by their own wars. Two, the Israelis, about a month and a half ago, started expanding their military operations against Iranian and Iranian-backed forces in Syria, particularly those supplying weapons to Hezbollah in Lebanon. And that has grown as the Lebanon ceasefire was being worked out. Then the third step has been the Turks allowing opposition forces and HTS to assume the offensive. So now we have a very fluid situation. Everyone, beginning with Washington, wants to restore stability because that's our instinct in every situation. But it will be hard to put Humpty Dumpty back together again, certainly not as before. There are going to have to be major concessions by Assad or whoever replaces him if he has to go in the central government to deal with the opposition forces backed by Turkey and to some degree the Kurds backed in the northeast by the U.S. and to respond to the Israeli demands that Syria stop being a highway of missiles and rockets to Hezbollah and Lebanon. So let's see how this turns out.
Thank you. And my last question will be about U.S. policy. Now there's going to be an administration change in Washington, and President Trump, in his first term, wanted to leave Syria. And you mentioned that the natural instinct of Washington is to create stability in the region. So do you think that leaving Syria, U.S. forces leaving Syria and creating stability can go hand in hand at the same time? Or would you think that there's going to be a change in the mindset of Washington and U.S. foreign policy when it comes to Syria, especially with regards to what's happening in the ground right now?
I hope so, first of all. And it's hard to predict what the U.S. will do because, first of all, we've got two governments, the current one and the one coming in, the new administration, with possibly very different ideas. But I think that there is a common position, a lowest common denominator. First of all, the troops are serving an important mission, which is to contain the Islamic State, as well as several other missions that I alluded to, less official but very important in denying terrain to all of the bad actors in Syria, and there are many, and keeping the United States in the game, and that's very important. So I think that the Biden administration, after looking at it many times, has decided not to pull troops out. The Trump administration was tempted to do so, and I experienced that in 2018 and 2019. But in the end, President Trump opted to keep the troops on. I think that that will be his decision again, given the very dramatic situation in Syria. It would be the wrong time to pull troops out. Now, but what should the United States push for? Again, we go back to 2254. The Biden administration has just emphasized that in its statements. The Trump administration also emphasized it. But this has to be augmented by very strong limits on Iranian involvement in Syria. That is not acceptable to the Syrian people. It has dragged them into wars, and that has to stop. So I think that that should be the American focus. What the American government should do, and this is my main criticism of the Biden administration, is to talk with the Russians again. The Obama administration and the Trump administration negotiated at high levels all the way up to Putin on a solution to Syria. It's one of the reasons we were able to freeze the conflict. The Biden administration has ignored Syria largely and broke off talks with the Russians way before the Ukraine war provided a rationale for doing so. That needs to end. We need to start talking with the Russians. I would propose during the Biden administration, but if not, as soon as the Trump administration comes in.
Thank you so much, Ambassador. Thank you so much for taking the time this morning. That was all my questions.